Unit 4, Lesson 4, New Deal Programs. The lesson objective is that students will be able to understand the impact the New Deal had on society and the expanding role of U.S. government in the 1930s. Our essential question for the day: how did the New Deal attempt to remedy problems from the Great Depression? And how are programs like the WPA or CCC a reflection of the New Deal? Unit 4, Lesson 4, Vocabulary. The presidential election of 1932 saw Franklin Delano Roosevelt elected, defeating incumbent President Herbert Hoover. Hoover was unpopular because of depression and his business-first policies. Roosevelt won in a landslide with 23 million votes compared to only 13 million votes for President Hoover. President Roosevelt, most famously known for the one line in his inauguration speech: "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And if some of you are wondering, there was a family connection between President Roosevelt, Teddy, and President Roosevelt, Franklin. Franklin Roosevelt was related to President Teddy Roosevelt through his wife Eleanor Roosevelt. His New Deal programs echoed some of President Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal programs during the Spanish-American War and imperialism era we studied earlier. Family connections between President Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt, connecting all the way back to President Teddy Roosevelt, are interesting in and of themselves. While Franklin Roosevelt was born into a wealthy family and served as the state senator, secretary of the Navy, and governor of New York, his wife was equally as prodigious in politics and culture. She was interested in progressive causes, in child welfare, housing reform, equal rights for women, and civil rights. She was an active speaker, writer, and quite popular in her time, and she helped influence President Roosevelt's progressive policies. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was not like other First Ladies who historically stayed in the background. She was quite influential in her own way and a powerful ally for the disadvantaged during the Great Depression. The first 100 days of every president's first year are monumental for what they can or can't accomplish. For President Roosevelt, his first 100 days can be summed up by 4 words: action and action now. He was tasked with confronting fear and restoring hope. He enacted 15 major pieces of New Deal legislation and got them approved by Congress within his first 100 days, expanding the government's role in the economy, the complete opposite of what President Hoover did in his prior administration. President Hoover believed in the limited role of government and that the market and businesses would sort themselves out. President Roosevelt went on radio to discuss his reforms with the public. Not only did this help keep the public informed directly from the president of what was happening and where it was happening, this helped restore confidence in the United States government and its institutions. What exactly is the New Deal? Well, the US government created programs that helped Americans bounce back from the Great Depression. The government provided direct relief to citizens who were suffering, and the US government created reform programs that regulated rules for businesses. During the time between election and taking office, President Roosevelt carefully picked advisors, professors, lawyers, and journalists who can help him enact his plan. They came to be called the Brain Trust, and they developed a set of policies to help problems generated by the Great Depression. Why should we care about the New Deal? Because America was in such a bad state that the potential for revolution or even a fascist takeover was right around the corner. This was occurring in Europe, which eventually led to World War II. The New Deal helped put many back to work, improving the economy and provided hope for the average American. It set the groundwork for how government works today, with increased government control and regulation, as well as safety nets for the poor and disadvantaged and disabled. Where growing old in America no longer equals growing poor and dying alone. Some New Deal programs are still in existence and still important to us today. The FDIC, for instance, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, protects your money when you put it in the bank. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, helps keep corporations from committing fraud. The National Labor Relations Board protects workers' rights. Social Security Administration is still around today. The New Deal also expanded electricity to rural areas throughout the Midwest and the South, developed numerous policies to help farmers, and paved the way for the conservation programs. Beginning with banking and finance reform, the cause of the crash in 1929. This was the first problem that President Roosevelt addressed. One reason for the Depression, remember, was the unregulated banking practices. President Roosevelt's first step was to declare a banking holiday. He closed all banks for a brief period of time. This served to prevent further withdrawals and panic and end the series of bank runs. Banks were then inspected to determine if they were solvent, which meant they could stay in business. Only those healthy banks that were solvent could stay in business. The rest were folded and the money was returned back to the investors and the customers. This restored public confidence in the American banking system. New Deal programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, put young men 18 to 25 back to work, building roads, parks, and bridges throughout this country. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, provided money to states to build schools and public buildings, created 4 million jobs in 1933 and 1934, and built 40,000 schools and paid for 50,000 teachers. National Recovery Association, or the original NRA, established a code of fair practice to stop the trend of wage cuts, fall prices, and layoffs. Created the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, to furnish loans for houses to low-income Americans. Created the Federal Emergency Relief Association, providing direct relief for the needy. The results of President Roosevelt's first 100 days and the first New Deal were that programs started during the first 100 days were helping, but gains were not as great as the president and his administration expected. Unemployment remained high, and production was still less than during the booming 1920s. The New Deal was still popular, so he had public support, helped greatly by the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who traveled the country by rail in support of the New Deal and its programs. FDR's efforts continued with the Second New Deal. With the Second New Deal came the second 100 days, where President Roosevelt and his brain trust or administration developed additional programs aimed at helping farmers, relief, labor unions, Social Security and social safety nets, and public utilities. The Second New Deal created direct help for farmers. Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act paid farmers for cutting production of soil-depleting crops in an attempt to avoid another Dust Bowl. They awarded farmers for good soil conservation methods to actively prevent another Dust Bowl from happening, and provided small loans to sharecroppers so they could buy land and begin farming for themselves. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, helped youth, professionals, and other workers. The program spent over $11 billion and put over 8 million people to work, creating 850 airports, 651 miles of roads and streets, 125,000 public buildings, and women made 300 million garments and pieces of clothing for the needy, all under WPA programs made possible by the Second New Deal of President Roosevelt's administration. Second New Deal under President Roosevelt's administration made great strides with labor unions, establishing the Wagner Act in 1935, which established collective bargaining and prohibited unfair firings of union members or organizing unions. And the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 created a maximum working hours of 44 hours per week per individual and set minimum wage nationally at 25 cents per hour. It also limited workers under 16 in their roles and responsibilities and the hours they were allowed to work. President Roosevelt and his Second New Deal created the Social Security Program and the Social Security Administration. The act was passed into law in 1935 and provided direct aid and relief to those over 65 years of age. Half the money came from workers and of their paycheck as a tax. The other half came from employers and of their corporate earnings and profits. Social Security touches the lives of every American, both directly and indirectly. Social Security helps older Americans, workers who become disabled, wounded warriors are veterans, and it also helps families in which a spouse or a parent dies. Social Security is a public pension program that every working American pays into so that every American, once they hit the age of 65, has a guaranteed income and medical benefits for the rest of their lives. Most of you students think of Social Security as this card. Maybe you have it in your wallet, your parents keep it for you, or you have it in some safe place in your house. Your Social Security card, as part of the Social Security Administration and program, has been around for nearly 100 years and is one of the greatest achievements of American government ever. The Second New Deal also had a major impact on public utilities throughout America. It expanded and helped expand electricity throughout America. In 1935, only 12.6% of farms in America had electricity. By 1949, only 14 years later, that percentage was up to 90%. There was also a growing need to regulate electrical utilities to make sure Americans were not overcharged for their power usage. One way that President Roosevelt was able to expand electricity throughout much of America was because of the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA Act. This act not only provided electricity, it taught better farming methods, replanting trees and building dams along rivers, generated and sold surplus electricity, created jobs, and conserved water, and began using water to create energy in large amounts throughout the country. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA Act of 1933, built dams and electric power stations throughout 7 states to control flooding and provide electricity throughout much of the South. Lastly, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set a national minimum wage and a maximum work week for Americans. beginning in 1938 at 25 cents per hour, all the way till now, the federal minimum wage at $7.25 per hour. Thankfully, we live in California where the minimum wage is $15 an hour, and we're not forced to adhere to the national standard of $7.25 an hour. In the next few slides, you'll see the 9 greatest monumental infrastructure projects created by the New Deal programs in President Roosevelt. The Hoover Dam. At the time of its completion, it was the tallest dam in the world. Today, it generates enough hydroelectric power per year to serve 1.3 million people. The Triborough Bridge, one of the major construction projects of the PWA helped finance, was New York City's Triborough Bridge, now the Robert F. Kennedy Bridge, which connected Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx in New York. In the late 1930s, the city of San Antonio secured funding from the WPA to improve infrastructure along the San Antonio River. Today, the San Antonio Riverwalk is a major commercial and tourist hub for the city. WPA funded the construction or improvement of roughly 800 airports, and one of the biggest ones was the WPA helped build was LaGuardia Airport in Queens, New York. One of the biggest projects that this corporation, the Tennessee Valley Authority, took on was the Chickamauga Dam, located on the Tennessee River outside of Chattanooga. Yet another New York City project that the PWA helped fund was the Lincoln Tunnel. The tunnel's center tube opened for traffic in 1937, allowing drivers to travel between New York and New Jersey under the Hudson River. Using WPA funding, New Orleans improved its city park in the 1930s by building sidewalks, bridges, and an art museum. This construction likely provided work to tens of thousands of people during the Great Depression, and also benefited residents by providing them with an improved public space. Construction began in 1933 and the bridge opened in 1936. With its 8-mile span, the San Francisco Bay Bridge was at that time the longest bridge in the world. The New Deal was also responsible for the first freeway. Both the PWA and the WPA helped fund the construction of Arroyo Seco Parkway, now known as the Pasadena Freeway, or 110, which connected Los Angeles to Pasadena. The freeway opened to traffic between 1938 and 1940 and reduced travel time between LA and Pasadena from 27 minutes to 12 minutes.